If you're like me, you just started climbing a month ago, but you have poor impulse control, so now you're building a home climbing wall. Apparently, I'm a little late to the party because these became all the rage when people got stuck at home during the COVID-19 pandemic. This video will walk you through the start to finish process of building one for somebody with little woodworking skill and no knowledge of climbing. So, this can't be that hard, right? You just buy some of those climbing wall grippy things and screw them to your wall, right? Wrong. Very, very wrong. Drywall is nowhere near strong enough to support the heavy bolts and the weight of a human hanging onto these holds. That is a great way to just punch a bunch of big holes in your wall and hurt yourself. Instead, you will be framing 3/4 inch plywood on top of an existing wall. This structure is much sturdier and can support the climbing holds and your weight. Let's explain what you'll be doing with the diagram because I think that's helpful, especially if you're new to this. Here's a top view of your wall. The drywall is usually about a 1/2 inch thick. In most homes, this is going to have 2x4 studs behind it that are typically spaced 16 inches center to center, although that can change as you get near things like windows and corners. You are going to be attaching more 2x4s in front of the drywall that are screwed to the studs with some pretty long screws. You're then going to screw the 3x4 plywood to these 2x4s with some shorter screws, and this gives you your structure for the climbing wall. However, before you screw the plywood to the wall, you're going to drill a bunch of holes in it and hammer in something called a T-nut from the back. We'll talk more about those later. These T-nuts allow you to attach the climbing holds and bolt them on from the front. Putting a grid of holes on the plywood preemptively allows you to attach more climbing holds later or rearrange the ones you have to make different courses. Got all that? Great. Let's get started. So the first thing you'll need to do is decide where you're going to put your climbing wall in your house and how big you want it to be. Ideally, you'll want an open wall that is free from nearby obstacles. You don't want anybody to fall off and hit their head on a piece of furniture. Most ceilings are about 8 feet high, making them a perfect size for a 4x8 sheet of plywood. I'm building mine in a basement with a drop ceiling, so it's going to be a little shorter. Once you've identified a wall, you might need to do some prep work like removing any molding. You can of course save this for later in case you ever decide to take the wall down and want to put the molding back up. Next, use a stud finder to locate and mark the edges of all the studs. Next, I find it helpful to make a drawing to figure out if you'll need to make any cuts and exactly how much lumber you'll need. Of course, you can do this by hand or in a CAD program, but honestly, I think it's fine to just do it in PowerPoint, especially if you set the grid size to 1/12 of an inch, then that gives you a nice scaled grid to work with. You can see I laid out my studs here and then figured out where I would put my plywood. I'm squeezing it in between a window and a support beam in the ceiling, so I am going to need to cut out a little notch in this one piece of plywood. Now, you should also start thinking about how many holes you want to put in the plywood, which relates to how much flexibility you'll have in the long run, but also how much money you're going to need to spend. I found that Atomic Climbing Holds, one of the companies that makes the holds we'll talk about later, has a good website with a variety of hole patterns for different numbers of holes, which will require different numbers of T-nuts. Remember, you have to hammer these nuts into the plywood in advance before you screw it onto the wall. So the more holes you need, the more versatility you have, but the more it's going to cost to buy all of those T-nuts. One more thing to note here, you'll see that I was lazy about laying out my grid pattern for the holes and accounting for where the 2x4s are going to be. So if you don't want to wind up with wasted holes, you can be a little more careful with this. You can also mount the 2x4s perpendicular to the wall to give yourself more space. Again, I think it is easier just to slap them on flat like this, but if you'd like to check out another video where somebody builds a slightly more complex frame with the 2x4s perpendicular, this guy is clearly a better carpenter than I am, so you can go check out his video instead. So from this plan, you should be able to figure out how much lumber you need and get that ordered. Now let's talk about buying the climbing holds themselves. Now, you can buy these holds directly from manufacturers, which if you just get into climbing, are probably companies you've never heard of like Metolius or Atomic. You can also get them at some outdoor stores like REI. Now, if you are buying from everybody's favorite evil billionaire, be careful. If you search for rock climbing holds on Amazon, a lot of what will come up is the cheaper holds that you would find at a kid's playground, but not what you would see in a real climbing gym. You'll see that these usually only come out to a couple dollars a piece, and from my experience at playgrounds, these have a lighter feel and a much smoother texture. If you find the real holds, you'll notice that these are much more expensive, usually in the range of $6 to $10 a piece. And while you can't really tell from the picture, they have more of a sandy, gritty texture to give you a better grip. The other thing to be very careful about is some of the climbing holds on Amazon are from UK sellers that use metric bolts. You see the M10 here refers to the threading on the T-nuts and the corresponding bolts, whereas some of the American vendors use 3/8 inch T-nuts and bolts. So you need to be careful if you are locking yourself into an ecosystem where you want future holds to be compatible with your wall. You can only buy one type of T-nut. You cannot mix and match the 3/8 and the M10 nuts, or these will not be compatible. And I have found that while you can find M10 T-nuts on Amazon in the US, they are much harder to find at hardware stores. So again, you should think about this when you are going with holds. Choose whether you are going metric or imperial with your units, and then make sure you get corresponding T-nuts. And remember that you're going to be putting those T-nuts in before you put the plywood on the wall, so if you want room for future expansion, you're going to need to order extras. And when you buy the climbing holds, make sure you check to see if the bolts and T-nuts are included or if you need to purchase them separately. Alright, enough talking about buying stuff, let's start building. As I mentioned earlier, I'm building this in a basement with a drop ceiling that is slightly less than 8 feet, so first I have to cut the 2x4s to length so they'll fit in my basement. Next, I pre-drilled holes in the 2x4s to make it easier to attach them to the studs. Then, I lined the 2x4s up on the wall, made sure they were level, used the pre-existing drilled holes to drill holes into the drywall, then removed the 2x4 to drill a longer pilot hole into the stud behind it, since I didn't have a drill bit long enough to go through everything all at once. And as a quick side note, my basement actually has metal studs, so I bought sheet metal screws to attach the 2x4s through the drywall to the studs, and then wood screws to use later to attach the plywood to the 2x4s. After pre-drilling all the holes, I lined the 2x4s back up and screwed them into the studs with the sheet metal screws. Repeat that process for each 2x4, and the wall is ready to just pop on the plywood later. This is probably a good time to mention that I probably could have used 2x3s instead, since they are a little thinner. That would have made more holes available for the climbing holds later. I'm going to lose some hole spacing to the width of the 2x4s, but I wanted it to be nice and sturdy, and I wasn't thinking about it that hard. Alright, with the 2x4s on the wall ready, now it's time for the plywood. Remember that my ceiling is less than 8 feet, so I need to trim a little bit off. If, like me, you don't have room for a table saw in your garage, then a straight guide like this for a circular saw is a lifesaver for cutting large pieces of plywood. If you don't have one of those, then they will usually do this for you with a big panel saw at Lowe's or Home Depot. And since that usually results in a pretty rough cut, be sure to hit the cut edge of the wood with some sandpaper. Now to mark the hole pattern. Again, you're going to want to make sure you have this figured out in advance. I used a tape measure or a large T-square to mark the edges for where I would have the grid of holes, and then I used this as an excuse to buy a chalk line to draw perpendicular lines to form a grid on the plywood. Since I'm doing a hexagonal grid of holes, I'm not drilling every single intersection, so I went through and marked the ones I was going to drill with a pencil. Now, I didn't want to have a lot of tear out on the front of the climbing wall from drilling large holes with a spade bit. So I went through with a tiny drill bit to drill pilot holes through from the back of the board. Then I flipped the sheet over, which is much easier if you have help. 3/4 plywood is heavy, so try not to hurt yourself if you are doing this alone. I managed not to. I then used the larger 1/2-inch spade bit to drill holes through from the front of the board. These are the holes that I'll be hammering the T-nuts into later, so it's important that they are just the right size. You don't want them too big or the T-nuts will not fit snugly. You can also see at this point I had attracted the attention of my helper, with appropriate safety gear, of course. Now, speaking of tear out, you can see the huge difference. Here's what a hole looks like from the top of the board, and here's what it looks like from the back of the board. Now, the front was still a little rough, so we did some sanding and filing to get those holes nice and smooth, because you don't want to get any splinters while you're climbing on the front. Next up was painting. Now, a lot of people just leave these bare, and of course, if you like the look of the bare wood, that is fine. We decided that we wanted more of a light gray look, so it sort of looked like stone. Now, according to the internet, if you do this, you should use floor paint, since that is designed to be very high traffic and have people stepping on it. And I decided to do this before I put the T-nuts on, because I did not want to risk the paint gunking up the threads of the T-nuts. I just followed the directions of the paint I bought, which said to do 3 coats on bare wood. I threw on a 4th coat for good measure. After the paint dried, it was time to hammer in the T-nuts. Now, since I had painted the front of the boards and I did not want to scratch it when I flipped the board upside down to hammer the T-nuts in from the back, I laid down a blanket, and as you can see, I got some assistance from my helper again when it came to hammering these in. Here's a close-up of what that looks like. Again, I drilled these holes so they're a snug fit for the T-nut. You place the T-nut in the hole and then give it a couple good whacks with a hammer, and the teeth on the nut will dig into the back of the wood, holding it in place and allowing you to bolt the climbing holds on from the front later. So you might have noticed in that earlier shot that some of the nuts looked a little different than the others. I believe these are called flange nuts, and they came with some of the climbing holds that I bought. So they work similar to the T-nuts, but instead of getting hammered in from the back and having teeth that grip the wood, they have holes and small screws that are very short so they don't poke through the front of the plywood, and you just screw these into place. So I wanted to use these instead of letting them go to waste, so I used the 10 of these that I got with one set of the climbing holds in addition to the T-nuts. After that, it was time to get the plywood lined up on the pre-existing framed 2x4s. You may have noticed the Christmas pajamas by now. My wife likes to buy our entire family matching Christmas pajamas, and I was putting this together on Christmas Eve after my daughter went to bed, so it could be a surprise the next morning, and I was too lazy to get changed. This part involved lots of pre-drilling and countersinking holes. I drilled a hole every foot on each 2x4 and then made sure the surface of the screw was nice and flush with the wood because you don't want any screws or jagged edges sticking out that you could snag your fingers on when you're climbing. After I had the plywood secured, it was time to bolt on the climbing holds, and remember, since you already hammered those T-nuts in from the back, now it's just a matter of using an Allen wrench to screw these on from the front. Now, the holds I bought come with a second hole for a screw to help stabilize it and prevent it from spinning when you climb on it slightly off center, but I wanted to give my daughter a chance to test everything out and finalize the roots before I started poking a bunch of extra holes in things, so I didn't attach those yet because I wanted to be able to plan the roots out and move things around without poking holes everywhere. Now, as for planting the roots, if you've ever been to a real climbing gym for some inspiration, you've probably seen that the roots are usually color-coded, so depending on how many holds you bought and what colors they came in, you might be able to do that, but if you don't have enough of each color, you might need to just mix and match. I had 6 of each color, which was just enough to get to the ceiling, but I probably could have used a few more. It's a bit of a stretch, so I'm probably going to wind up buying a few more so I can do 7 or 8, maybe 9 holds per root from floor to ceiling. And I probably should have mentioned this earlier, you don't really want your kids jumping or landing directly on the floor, so make sure you budget for a gymnastics mat, or these are also called crash pads if you search for them online, so you can have a nice soft landing. So there you have it, start to finish build of a home climbing wall from a guy who just started climbing a month ago and is not that good at woodworking. I hope this video was useful to parents who find themselves in a similar situation. Feel free to leave a comment asking questions or telling me what I did wrong, and go ahead and check out my channel for other mediocre woodworking projects. Thanks.